Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are. I'm Claudia Gollmeier, Head of Investment Management for Asia Pacific and Middle East and Africa here at Colchester Global Investors. I also co-chair the ASCOR project, which stands for Assessing Sovereign Climate-Related Opportunities and Risks. I'm very excited today as the webinar during which we will present the results from the latest State of Transition in Sovereign's 2024 report, which was curated by the Transition Pathway Initiative Centre, the TPI, at the London School of Economics, LSE. The academic research expert has developed the ASCOR framework together in consultation with investors and the wider public, and has now, since the end of last year, assessed 70 countries based on that framework. We will be starting with the presentation of the report by Antonina Scheer. She is a policy fellow and a senior research project manager at the TPI Centre, which has led the ASCOR project on the research side. This will be followed by the panel discussion, which will focus on implications of the report's findings for market participants, and it will be including both sovereign issuers and sovereign market investors. We will be exploring key takeaways from the findings of the report, the possible practical applications, and future considerations of the tools. The panel discussion will be moderated by the Executive Director of the TPI Centre at the LSE, Professor Carmen Nuzzo. And of course, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions later on, but please put them in the chat function throughout the webinar, as we do want to make this as interactive as possible. So since we have a lot to get through today, let's get started. And with that, I'll be passing the baton on to Antonina Scheer. Over to you, Antonina.
Thanks very much, Claudia. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all. I'm Antonina. I'm a research project manager at the TPI Centre. As Claudia mentioned, I'll be giving a broad overview of our research findings from the 2024 report. And I just wanted to note that the webinar will be recorded and made available online, technology permitting. Just as a brief introduction, the TPI Centre at the London School of Economics is the research partner of the investor-led Transition Pathway Initiative. We at the TPI Centre provide academically robust and independent assessments of how companies, but also banks and sovereigns are making progress on the low-carbon transition in line with the Paris Agreement. Our assessments are based on transparent public disclosures, and our methodologies are made available on our website. So transparency is very key to our mission. The assessment data that we have across the corporate banking and sovereign assessments are all open access available on our online tools. The ASCOR project in particular, which Claudia kindly introduced, is also an investor-led project where the TPI Centre acts as the academic research expert, providing the data and framework methodology. What the ASCOR tool does is assess countries not only on their progress managing the low-carbon transition, but also on managing the impacts of climate change itself. Here you can see the range of supporters, including asset owners, asset managers, and investor networks with a focus on climate change. The way that we use the ASCOR framework is built on three specific pillars that assess different aspects of country climate performance. So first, on emissions pathways, we undertake a quantitative benchmarking of countries' historical emissions and also a similar quantitative benchmarking of their forward-looking targets. In the second pillar, we analyze the climate policies of countries. So we focus on those that might be aimed at mitigation, including carbon pricing, but we also assess adaptation policies that are aimed at reducing physical risk, and also just transition policies, which focus on managing the social implications of decarbonization. Finally, in our third pillar, called climate finance, We analyze a range of topics, including international climate finance contributions and also disclosures of both costing information for achieving climate goals and information on what countries are spending towards those climate goals. A very key feature of the ASCOR tool is integrating a principle of fairness. What I mean by that is essentially undertaking ways to integrate common but differentiated responsibilities into the tool. And this is a principle enshrined in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it essentially describes the imperative of high-income countries having to shoulder a larger burden of mitigation efforts, recognizing the competing development priorities of middle and low-income countries. So in the ASCOR tool, the way that we put this principle into practice is through income group exemptions. So we assess high-income countries on all applicable indicators, but we apply a tiered set of exemptions for middle-income and low-income countries, precisely to recognize those competing development priorities that these countries have. Snapshot of our analysis that we're able to provide in 2024 includes 70 countries. This is a much more comprehensive analysis compared to 2023, when the ASCOR tool was first launched with a pilot set of only 25 countries. This larger set of 70 countries now accounts for 85% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 90% of global GDP. These are also the most relevant countries to sovereign bondholders, as this set of countries covers 75 to 100% of the major sovereign bond market indices. As the overarching snapshot of this analysis, we have this bar chart, which includes all of the results for all 70 countries across all 14 areas of the ASCOR framework, which you can see 12 of those here today, 13 of them, sorry. So in this bar chart, we show this snapshot across all of our countries that we assess. Just to describe a little bit how the bar chart is put together, the green indicates the share of countries on that area who received yes on all applicable binary indicator questions in that area. And we'll go through a few examples so you can see what I'm referring to on these binary questions. The red indicates the share of countries that received no on all those indicators, and the orange segment on partial results indicates a mix of yes and no's in that given area. So the overarching message we have here from our analysis echoes similar findings from other organizations and research institutions that assess and track progress on the low carbon transition. That finding is that countries need to enhance their ambition and need to accelerate climate action very significantly. What we are able to find in our analysis, and we welcome you all to take a look at the report, is further granularity on where there are areas, shoots of optimism, we could say, or areas of improvement that really need to be ramped up. So on the side of optimism, we can say nearly all countries have a 2030 target. This is an obligation under the Paris Agreement. But also the majority of countries we assess, you can see on the area of net zero targets, 80% have a net zero target. We also find that 40 countries among the 70 we assess have a climate framework law, which I'll be discussing in a bit more detail in the coming slides. There's also a significant share, 65% of countries, that have published some form of disclosure on their climate-related spending. Now, on the side of improvement, there are a range of topics that need further improvement. I'll just focus on two. So based on our analysis, no country among those we've assessed has neither an emissions trend nor a 2030 target that aligns with their national 1.5 degrees benchmark. If you take a different approach to allocating the 2030 carbon budget, for example, using fair shares, which is a parallel analysis that we do in the report, there are some countries whose emissions reduction targets are ambitious enough, and we welcome you to check that out in the report. The last area of improvement I would highlight is on the fossil fuels area. So this area assesses whether countries are making clear commitments to phase out both fossil fuel subsidies and fossil fuel production. You can see 65% of countries are assessed no on this entire area. So there's very much room for improvement in this area. As you can see from the range of topics I've just touched on very briefly, the ASCOR framework is too large and complex to go through in detail during this presentation. So what we've decided to do for the presentation is walk through a selection of area deep dives to give a clearer picture of what's the snapshot of our results, very specifically for the countries that we've assessed. So the three areas that we'll focus on today are climate legislation, sectoral transitions, and climate costing. And if you're interested in any of the other areas, for example, carbon pricing, please do take a look at the report. So first, we assess countries on whether they have a climate framework law. These laws are worth assessing and worth examining because they set a strategic direction to deliver either mitigation or adaptation outcomes, or both. And they do this by establishing a legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for national climate policy making. Some climate framework laws set out a net zero target or an emissions reduction target for a specified year, but others do not and simply set out a framework for climate action for that country. Climate laws are useful because they enable policy continuity, since they're difficult to amend or repeal compared to other executive efforts and documents and policies. The second indicator we have here looks specifically at the strength of that climate framework law based on whether key accountability elements are specified. So what this means is, does the law specify which actors are accountable to which other actors, and what happens in the case of non-compliance with the obligations that are set out in the law? With this analysis, we're able to give further credibility to any emissions reduction targets that are assessed in the first pillar, because if they're set out in law or mitigation efforts are set out in law, they can be considered more credible. We have here a timeline which shows the assessment results of our analysis. So these are the 40 countries that have passed a climate framework law among those that we've assessed. So the first was passed by Japan right after hosting the COP in Kyoto, and followed by New Zealand and the UK. Since the Paris Agreement especially, these kinds of laws have proliferated. And as you can see, this goes beyond only high-income countries, but also middle and low-income countries are increasingly finding this a useful way to harmonize and institutionalize their climate efforts. The next area where I'll do a brief deep dive is sectoral transitions. So this is a complex area that covers a range of policies and sectors. So I'll actually only focus in on electricity for today. So the way that we assess electricity sector transition progress is first through a binary indicator question that asks whether the country has a net zero target specifically for the electricity sector that is aligned with 1.5 degrees. What this means is countries in industrialized advanced economies need to have a net zero electricity sector by 2035 to align with 1.5 degree modeling. In the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, this deadline is later in 2045. And the reason the electricity sector needs to reach net zero sooner than other sectors is primarily due to cost factors, that it's more feasible to decarbonize this sector sooner than others. We complement this binary indicator, which sets an ambition for that sector, with a quantitative performance metric that looks at the percentage of the country's current electricity grid that is generated from low carbon energy sources. So we have a diagram here now to provide this snapshot. These are the results that we found. So these are the 12 countries that have net zero electricity sector targets that are aligned with their respective 1.5 degree benchmarks for that sector. Also included in this diagram is the progress that these countries are making towards meeting those targets. So what we can see is countries including Costa Rica, Denmark, Finland, and New Zealand appear to be on track to meeting their sectoral net zero targets. The final area that I'll give a brief showcase to is climate costing. So here we assess transparency in the disclosure of the costs of meeting climate goals. Under the Paris Agreement, developing countries agreed to provide this type of information, in part to disclose their financial support needed, with the aim of having that facilitate financial flows and mobilize finance, either from developed countries or from multilateral development banks or the private sector. In this area, we assess specifically whether the country has disclosed a transparent breakdown of the costs of implementing either their mitigation goals as set out in their nationally determined contributions or their adaptation goals as set out in their national adaptation plans. So these are two separate indicators that we assess, and we look for that level of transparency. Currently, this area, we only assess middle and low-income countries, and that's because these are the countries that agreed under the Paris Agreement to disclose this information. So there's a reporting mandate and a reporting regime for these types of countries. However, in future, depending on how disclosure practices, but also investor expectations evolve, we may begin assessing high-income countries on this area as well. The snapshot of results for this area, we show a diagram where you can see the countries that have published this kind of information for mitigation only, for adaptation only, or for both. Among the countries we've assessed, we find a variety of ways and granularities at which these cost information are disclosed. So some countries publish it only at the sector level, whereas others also disclose the costs of implementing specific measures to decarbonize specified sectors. So with this, we find countries falling in a few different buckets, and I'll just highlight that Egypt, Argentina, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Panama are the countries who disclosed at the highest level of granularity, and they done this for both mitigation and adaptation. Countries that provide this kind of disclosure and information on the costs of meeting climate action goals demonstrate a degree of financial preparedness for implementing those mitigation and adaptation goals, and can thereby help mobilize finance towards those goals. Aside from these area level deep dives, in the report, we've also explored a way of synthesizing the assessment results. I want to clarify that ASCOR does not aggregate the assessment results into a single country score, instead providing an in-depth and nuanced picture of country climate performance. In the ASCOR tool, you find country results disaggregated by area with detailed information on each and every indicator and metric that they've been assessed on. However, in the report, to be able to analyze cross-country patterns, to be able to see whether income or region play a factor in determining climate performance of countries, we needed to simplify and synthesize the ASCOR results to some degree. So we've done this by calculating two pillar level scores. Firstly, grouping together the emissions pathway pillar indicators and metrics to reflect overall the country's recent mitigation efforts and their forward-looking mitigation ambitions. And a second pillar score, which groups together climate policies and the climate finance pillars into one pillar score that reflects the range of tools, policies, systems, and disclosures that can be used to implement those mitigation goals as well as adaptation goals. A key design principle of the ASCOR tool is to avoid constraining financial flows to emerging markets and developing countries, partly because these are the countries that require largest amounts of transition finance, but also because the tool was designed, as I mentioned at the beginning, to put into practice fairness principles. What we have done to also put this into practice is we analyze the ASCOR performance data and recommend rather comparing countries within income groups rather than across income groups. So we have here an analysis that illustrates the distribution of pillar scores for our different income groups that we assess. And you can see the box plot basically illustrates a distribution where each line is a quartile and the X marks the mean of the distribution. So for example, in the emissions pathway pillar, low-income countries have a lower distribution of climate performance. In part, this is because of factors including access to financial resources, access to technologies, and a higher emissions intensity starting point in many sectors. In the report, what we do is present pillar scores for all of the countries that we assess, but they're grouped by quartile and grouped into their respective income groups. in that way, what we aim to illustrate is that income group averages can serve as a useful benchmark to more appropriately evaluate the performance of any given country, subject to their own financial, institutional, technological, and other constraints. With this in mind, we can see countries such as Nigeria, Costa Rica, and Denmark coming out as leaders in the first pillar score, and that is relative to their respective income groups. I'll now just close my presentation with 3 brief learnings for national governments, which emerged from our analysis and echoes similar findings and information gaps identified by investors and also other stakeholders and academia. The first learning is that governments can adopt a whole of government vision. This can be very useful to coordinate ministries and create clear market signals. What we've discussed today in terms of climate framework laws can be a very useful way to put that into practice. Countries can also translate their national ambitions to the sectoral level. This creates policy certainty and sets out a sectoral direction that can improve corporate ambition and also investor confidence. Lastly, countries, and the idea here of translating national ambitions to the sectoral level is something that we assess and illustrate with the analysis of net zero electricity sector targets. And lastly, the third finding is countries can develop climate investment plans. These can be very useful both to clarify funding needs, but also identify sources of finance, set out country platforms, for example. A starting point for this can be the climate costing disclosures that we discussed in this presentation. Thanks very much. I'm pleased to hand over to Carmen to moderate the discussion.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Nina, for the very insightful presentation, and thank you to all the team who's been supporting this effort. We're really proud of what we have achieved this year, covering 70 countries that together represent 90% of global GDP, 85% of GHG emissions, and between 75 and 100% of the world government bond indices. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our esteemed panelists. Before I do that, I want to thank the audience because I can see that you've already started addressing, posing questions and using the function that you can see at the bottom of the screen. And I would ask Nina, perhaps, whilst we start talking with our panelists, to address some of the questions online, if possible. I can answer one very quickly, actually the last one. Somebody's asked if we publish pillar scores per countries. They are in the State of Transition report. They're not in the country pages, so you can see those there. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce you to our esteemed panelists of today, who, in addition to Claudia Gollmeier, who is the Head of Investment Management, APAC and EMEA, Managing Director, Singapore, Colchester Global Investors. She also, as she said earlier in the webinar, the co-chair, one of the 4 co-chairs of the ASCOR project. But her contribution to the panel today will bring her expertise as a portfolio manager, an experienced portfolio managers in the sovereign bond space. And I'm also delighted to introduce you to Hyun Kwak, who is Director for Future Vision and Strategy Division within the Ministry of Economy and Finance at the Republic of Korea. He's overseeing the ministry's green policy, having previously been in charge of the government's ministry's bond policy division. And I take the opportunity to congratulate Sang on his recent promotion, which is effective as of today. So we're delighted to have you here and have the opportunity to celebrate with you as well. So let me start with you, Claudia, with your investor hat on. What are the key features that stood out to you from the State of Transition report as a sovereign bond portfolio manager?
Yeah, thank you. I think just starting with the tool itself, it's a great tool because the way as investors, we see it as a one-stop shop. And what I mean by that is it provides us with all the data that we can use for comparative and analysis and engagement. And it also provides us with the up-to-date information on national climate performance, which Antonina was mentioning earlier. And not just that, it actually has the ability for us to click on all the individual links of the data sources there. And that helps us quite a lot to dig deeper in our analysis for investment purposes as well. And at the same time, it offers, as Antonina also kindly shared, is the country performance. We can compare it within the region, the various income levels, and also, fossil fuel dependencies. And you can also read much more on that in section 3, I think, on the report. Also, I think the last part with that is that we're taking out the income biases if we have these income groups put in place. The last one I would say is also on the engagement work. Historically, what we have seen is when we engage with countries, a lot of times we're starting to discuss, first of all, what is the exact or what is the relevant data source, or are we all having the correct one? So we're spending half of that on that. But since it's done assessed independently, we're taking all of that discussion out and we're having just one relevant discussion. And Antonina also was noting some of the gaps earlier in the report, which is also important for, I think, not just investors, but also for issuers or sovereigns themselves, because this way they are where the gaps are. It opens the dialogue, but importantly also doesn't need to be seen as a negative, which is, I think, that is always the problem, that issuers tend to see it as a negative if there are gaps. It's actually not. It's just keeping in mind that all countries coming from a different starting point, and therefore we having these differences, and therefore everyone has different constraints. Additionally, we can use that analysis because Antonina was sharing. We have the climate laws and the climate pillars and pillar 2, that it helps us in the analysis if an investor or an issuer as entities intentions are aligned with the issuance of a green bond or any labeled bonds as well, as with their policies and their frameworks. And lastly, I think going forward, what would be interesting to see if we could expand or strengthening that pillar 3 in climate finance, because it does help to have more transparency from governments on that front, but also perhaps they're not quite ready at this point to have this conversation. And I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. Claudia, definitely pillar 3, the climate finance one, is probably the one that will be subject to most development going forward. I really like the point that you made about engagement, because the ASCOR tool was conceived for investors to nurture that dialogue, or more than nurturing, starting that dialogue with sovereign issuers, because there is engagement that's been done with sovereign issuers, but not often on climate-related topics. And the framework is really meant to inform investors to have useful conversation, but also, as you rightly pointed out, for issuers to showcase the progress that they're making, and for peer learning as well, because they can learn from what other countries' good practices are being put in place. Sang, let me turn to you. Your appointment today, I think, is a further signal that the Republic of Korea is committed to the transition to a low-carbon economy. And taking the ASCOR framework as a structure and bearing this in mind, can you highlight how investors and other stakeholders can track the progress that the Republic of Korea has made so far?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me in this discussion. So South Korea is a kind of an inflection point in climate change issues. So let me back to the 2008 a little quick. At that time, the South Korea government initiated the green growth as a top policy agenda, but it failed because there was no concrete data, reliable data, and any no well thought out guidelines, and no collecting some good best practices. So it was just remaining some political rhetoric, but things are changed after the 2015. I mean, Paris Agreement was made at that year. So after that, South Korea has been catching up the global trend in dealing with climate change risk. Let me elaborate on some aspect based on your great report. Regarding the emission pathways pillar 1, we set up a net zero target in the framework law on carbon neutrality. This is a very ground stone for any policy and any action plan. And next, when it comes to strategic direction, we established the Framework Act on Carbon Neutrality, which includes what we should do and what the action plan must do, and what the review should be made, how the review should be made. Apart from those government actions and framework, so our Korean exchanges and financial regulatory bodies recently collaborated on issuing some voluntary-based climate action. Its name is a KOSPI market disclosure rules. So this is a list of the mandatory disclosure standards on ESG for financial institutions and any companies. Apart from that, South Korea has published the assessment report. This is because we are strongly believe that apart from setting up the action plan and strategic direction, assessing the current result and revisit our current policy, and then review those policies and find some room for the improvement is key for successful transition policy. So recently after the 2015, we also starting operating emission trading system. So we do believe it is one of the most activated emission trading systems. So overall, South Korea, is true that South Korea had been falling behind some global trend before the 2015, but after that we has been picking up the trend. I think the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement and some reliable data and some well thought out global standards and guidelines could have been very helpful for our government to establish and implement our climate change risk related policies very successfully. But more importantly, we don't stop here, because the climate change actions has been still ongoing, and that risk is not in the future, it's just right before us. So we are not stop here, and we are keeping moving forward. So in this concept, your project and your suggestions and your data collections could be very, very helpful and very meaningful for South Korea government. And I strongly believe it could be very, very it could do very great contribution for other countries' government to establish and implementing the climate change actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very, very pleased to hear that, Sang, and really interested in the journey that you have been taking on, really keeping the policy as a living path that gets constantly updated and progresses further. Let me turn back to Claudia. And if you see me typing every so often, it's because we're getting lots of questions. So please do keep posing them. And if you can identify yourself for transparency, that would be great as well. I will want to get to as many as possible. And so I would like to ask one more question to Claudia and Sang, and then open to the floor to the questions that we're receiving from the audience. Claudia, there is no secret that many governments are fiscally challenged at the moment, and probably they're not ready to have these difficult conversations. Somebody posted in the chat a question regarding the fact that I mentioned that Pillar 3 is the one that is probably subject to most development going forward, and it's partly related to the fact that governments are not used to disclosing information when it comes to how they intend to fund the climate transition. We've also seen, sadly, recently some countries backpedaling on their climate ambition. Do you think that this will change investors' expectations and the dialogue that they will have with sovereigns going forward?
Just before I answer your question, which is very topical, Carmen, clearly at this point in time, but I do want to say to Sang, I agree with, from an investor's point of view, with South Korea's, progress they've made, and also it's really good to have experienced that access to the government from an investor's point of view to have this engagement and dialogue on that front. So I think that's also showing it is working. Back to your question, Carmen. Yes, very topical. And I'm not going to comment on the changed political landscape, but what I can say is that the ASCOR framework remains still very relevant, irrespective of all of that. And especially because investors like us, we look at or use the tool to look through the lens of risk management. And the risk assessment remains for us key. And so what do I mean by that? It's important that we understand how countries are implementing the climate actions, and therefore the ASCOR assessment remains relevant together with among many other tools which we have at our disposal. Whilst the ASCOR tool itself, its strictest way is not a risk assessment tool, it helps us in framing those risks. And also it helps us, what's important is to understand how prepared and resilient countries are, which again are indicators provided by the ASCOR tool. And we talked about the climate financing or funding, which again goes to Pillar 3. It's important for us to understand, obviously amongst other factors, what are the how countries' fiscal and balances are affected, the debt sustainability paths, but as well, not always just looking at the negatives, there are the positives of the investment opportunities we shouldn't forget about, which we have seen in many other countries. And so that's why it's important to do look at Pillar 3 and is extremely helpful. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. Sorry, thank you, Claudia. Very quickly, I have another question for Sang. You very insightfully went through all the path that has led to the development of your green policies earlier. Can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges, not just focusing on the progress that you've made, but the challenges that as sovereign issuers you've encountered when you started thinking about how to frame these policies, and also has you brought them forward?
Yes, that's a very good question. There are several challenges for the government and sovereign issuers in issuing green bonds and following up some green transition. The first thing is definitely greenwashing, and second one is the cost of capital. Greenwashing definitely is a big problem in any climate transition action, but for government, if if there is some very small portion of greenwashing, even if it's a very small portion of greenwashing, government might lose some support from the National Assembly. This is very important for any government because National Assembly has the right and power to approve and review any government budget and government project for the green finance. So to get some strong and sustainable support from National Assembly is very important. So in this context, we need to deal with the greenwashing. And secondly, cost of capital. Regarding the green finance and the green bond, the green premium is the key for successful insurance. This is because the green premium is the very, very strong and clear token for our governments to be engaged in the green transition activities and projects. So in this context, I think there are several solutions to deal with this issue. Firstly, we strongly believe that government and any regulatory bodies should design related policies based on internationally approved standard and guidelines and approved best practices. Also, all of the action plans must be based on the data-driven. So secondly, I do believe the KPI and the review process is very important. So setting up the crystal clear and concrete KPI and well thought out guidelines aligned properly with our global shared values and targets is the key solutions for dealing with the greenwashing and problem of the green premium.
Yeah, so very much important to have credible, measurable, and transparent KPIs to follow what you said, Sang, about the importance of having the legislative powers on board to implement the transition plan, and reassure them about greenwashing is key, really, also to bulletproof the transition plan, regardless of which color government might have and which party might be in power at any point in time. I actually have a further question to you that's now coming to the audience, and I'm trying to take as many as I can from those that you very kindly posted. Keep going and make yourself known if you can, please. So somebody asked if you have received many questions from investors on Korea's on the assessment that you've received from the ASCOR framework for Korea. Has somebody started using to engage with you on this topic?
Yes, definitely. South Korea have a plan to issue green bond and green bond from the next year, not for this year. So we have making some regular plan for this issue. But having said that, actually over the last 2 years, South Korea government have received a lot of questions our climate change actions and transition finance, and most of definitely South Korea government is totally completely committed to meeting some global target, net zero neutral target. But the one weakness was that we don't have any sovereign green debt instrument. So that's the reason why many investors have made some suggestions and made some doubt about our green policies. Definitely, most of them is about our commitment to the net zero neutrality and any plan for issuing government bonds. Actually, our plan to issue the green sovereign debt bond is actually suggested by from many foreign investors, including some central banks and asset management and pension funds, because they need to have some green financial instruments to meet up the ESG target and their own climate change goals. So that's the reason why I'm here today to introduce the South Korea's commitment and eagerness to be going towards some going green in our economy and financial sector and sovereign debt market. Thank you.
Great, and we're delighted to have you here, Sang. Next question is, I take not necessarily in order, but let me see. There is a question from Nick Robbins. Thanks, Nick, for posing the questions on related to the just transition and the work that actually is also going on here at the LSE at the London School of Economics. Nick is asking, how far will the ASCOR assessment help to drive the integration of climate factors in credit ratings and the pricings of sovereign bonds? I can address this very quickly, and maybe I'll hand over briefly to Antonina to comment on the just transition component that we assess as part of the ASCOR framework. The credit rating agencies have shown interest for the ASCOR project. We have been keeping them informed about the development of the framework, and we hope that we will be able to work with them to better inform their credit rating opinion assessments. They also, on their side, have started to look more, at least more transparently about how the transition may affect the funding needs and that fiscal sustainability path, where governments are clearly committed to it, especially if they've already turned their net zero targets into legislation. Perhaps I'll stop here and hand over quickly to Nina to just comment on the just transition before we move on to the next question. Thank you.
Maybe all I'll say to save time for other questions is it's quite a novel assessment that we have on just transition in the ASCOR tool. There aren't many other climate alignment assessment frameworks that include this type of analysis. And we go beyond only having a sort of overarching approach to just transition consultation, but we look for very specific things like green job strategies and also whether the countries are taking into account distributional impacts of carbon pricing, for example. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I'd encourage Sang and Claudia to also keep an eye on the Q&A chat. So if you want to address any particular question, please do feel to jump in. There is another question that has been posed by an anonymous attendee. He or she is asking, how can your research best be used to compare investment in sovereign debt as compared to investment grade corporate debt in a particular jurisdiction? This is an area where we would like to do more research on, not necessarily related to the credit quality of the corporates that investors invest in. It's more related to how we can overlay the information or the learnings that we can extrapolate from the ASCOR assessments onto the corporate assessments that we also do here at the Transition Pathway Initiative Center to provide more nuancing, if you will, and more contextualization around the jurisdiction in which these corporates operate. We've already started doing this with the State of Transition report that is focusing on corporates and that has been published in September. I can post a link in the chat, and in that early exercise that we've started to do, we've demonstrated that actually it matters, the size, the sector, and the jurisdiction in which a company operates matters insofar as it goes in the progress that these companies are making in the transition to a low carbon economy. We plan to do more work going forward on what we call a regionalization program, if you will, whereby we will be able to provide more information and help investors really have this common approach to sector approach to assess companies across different jurisdictions, but equally get more familiar and more acquainted with the local knowledge of the markets in which companies operate. Let me look at another question. There is the question for Claudia and Sang with regards to the alignment of the ASCOR tool and sovereign green bonds. How do you imagine the relationship between these two evolving? There are actually two questions, sorry. And could ASCOR not just complement but catalyze green bond activity from sovereign? Do you think that that ASCOR can not just complement but catalyze green bond activity from sovereigns? Who wants to go first, Claudia or Sang?
I'm happy to go first from the investor's point of view. I do think it's ASCOR tool is already complementing quite a lot the assessment for investors in terms of the credibility of their framework and in conjunction with their climate laws. And as Antonina actually pointed out during her report, she noted that the climate laws actually set the strategic direction of a country. And that's precisely what we're looking for. Is we obviously don't want to see countries issuing labeled bonds just to get cheap financing or to bypass other issues. So we want to make sure within our assessment those are aligned, and that's where the ASCOR framework complements our additional research we have and checks that it's a credible framework.
Great. And Tsang, do you want to add anything very quickly on this point? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question.
Yes, it's definitely the relationship is very strong and very important. This is because just issuing green bond is just nothing, because issuing green bond and green bond itself should be highly aligned with our green targets and transition targets. So in this context, these tools play a role for guidelines and better practice and increase the transparency and predictability to green bond, green sovereign debt bond market. So I think this is I think these two things I think has been evolving from each other very simultaneously.
And I to add to one point which
Sure.
Hyun just made was it's not just green bonds. Those they can use KPIs out of these indicators from the ASCOR framework to come up with new innovative finance products. Is it SLBs? Because each country has different issues they want to address, and so maybe different KPIs might be more useful. And having a third-party independent assessment is also quite helpful, I think, for investors to make it more credible.
Yeah, and just to say that the ASCOR framework is not about, excuse me, green bonds. It is really to help inform investors about the overall strategy, policies in place, and the progress the countries are making in their decarbonization efforts. Although having a green bond often facilitates a dialogue between issuers and investors, and it can be an open starting point to open these conversations and talk about the overall broader strategy, how much would the implementation costs and how eventually this will affect the fiscal sustainability path of a given country. Perhaps I'll ask the next question to Antonina. Has there been a lot of demand to see ASCOR reports showing the progress made in mitigation and adaptation measured against their NDCs?
Thanks for the question. Yes, we have received a lot of investor interest. We should note the tool has only existed for just over a year, with the first data published at the end of 2023. And that first data set only had 25 countries. So with the ramp up in coverage, we now see a much larger possibility for investors to integrate this into their decision making. Coverage was highlighted as a key limitation for investors to use this data. So now over the last months, we've been hearing a lot more interest in developing different tools. For example, assessing the alignment of sovereign bond frameworks with climate goals, sovereign bond portfolios with climate goals is one of those key use cases where the coverage was a limiting factor.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to address one question very quickly. It's from Alex Lehman. He's asking if the ASCOR tool is suitable for sovereign SLBs. Yes, the answer is yes. We really do want, we really do hope that many of the indicators that we assess can be used as KPIs to support the construction of credible SLBs and really help investors to monitor and track the progress that countries are making towards the reaching of those KPIs as part of the overall strategies I was saying earlier. So definitely something that we want to encourage. It is a pity that the SLB market hasn't developed further for a variety of reasons, but we've seen quite a lot of activity in Latin America and more recently also in Rwanda. So definitely perhaps a space that is, that as we hope, will expand further going forward. There is a question for Sang. What's the read across from corporate issuance versus sovereign issuance? Do you see stronger greenium persistence at the sovereign level, or does investor differentiate break down? Do you want to comment on this, Sang? You're on mute, Sang. You have to unmute yourself.
Could you elaborate on the question again, please?
I don't know if the person who's posed the question, because he or she hasn't identified themselves, but all they wrote is sorry, this is a question from Ting. So I got mixed up with the question above that. Ting from Standard Charter is asking, what's the read across from corporate issuance vis-a-vis sovereign issuance? Do you see stronger greenium persisting at the sovereign level as opposed to the corporate level? In general, what I can see is like in the developing market world, the greenium has almost disappeared, but it's still persistent in other countries, in other regions. I suspect partly because it's driven more by a demand issue more than a differentiation existing on the credit quality of the bonds. But I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yes, that's so I don't think I have the full answers for this question, but I think to ensuring some green premiums and liquidity levels, I mean the credibility and the transparency of the issuing bonds and the following process is a key for guaranteeing some green premiums compared to other corporate green bond. So, but I'm sorry, I don't have a full answers for this issue, but I can get back to you sometime soon with my full answers.
We definitely can follow up. Thank you for that. I'm going to address quickly a question from Aaron Lester. He's asking, I had addressed this in typing, but I'll repeat this again. He's asking, with coverage of 70 countries for 2024, what are our expectations for 2050? So maybe, Antonina, I'll hand over to you because I know the answer, but I want to give you a chance also to, to showcase what we're doing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, happy to. I was just in the middle of responding to that question. So we'll be planning to assess 80 countries in 2025. That's the target for this year. But we'll be ramping up towards over 100 in the coming years to hit that 100% of those sovereign bond market indices I mentioned.
Great, thank you. And with that, somebody asked, because I posted a couple of answers saying we'll do this subject to funding. We are philanthropically funded, and so we're subject to receiving more funding to continue this work. But if everything goes according to plans, we'll continue with our annual assessments and further developments of the framework as well. So Aaron is asking another question, this time to Claudia, and I'll ask Claudia to be very brief because we're almost at time. So have you seen much interest for sovereign issuers to adopt SLBs with ASCOR-linked targets, or have some sovereigns who either were or were not covered by the ASCOR assessment in the past been watching this closely with this in mind?
Yeah, definitely sovereigns are watching this very closely, and we are having these discussions because I said before, one size doesn't fit all. And so this is very much in the forefront of issuers and the dialogue between issuers and investors.
Great. I think we can probably take a last question very quickly. Let me go through this. There was a question related to African markets that I can no longer see. I don't know if Antonina or one of you has already replied to it, but perhaps staying with you, Claudia, can you comment very briefly on what you see in the Asian markets at the moment?
Yeah, Asia is obviously very heavy coal dependent, and therefore transition finance is super important there. And as said before, we have seen innovative financing products coming out, such as in the case of Japan, that they've done GX bonds, and I would suspect we're going to see that transition. More work has been done with the G funds on the banks as well. So there's lots of work going on, and as we've also heard from Sang in Korea, so this journey is certainly going to continue, and investors and issuers have that dialogue open, and I'm sure ASCOR comes in very handy in potentially open opportunities for using some of these indicators for KPIs.
Great, thank you. And just to reply very quickly to that question, referring specifically to Africa, at the moment we don't cover that many African countries. We do cover 45 countries in the high income bracket, 17 in the middle income bracket, and only 8 in the low income bracket. But hopefully, the coverage will increase as our expansion plans continue. We're at time. We'll try to answer the questions that we haven't been able to answer live by email. Thank you so much for posing them. Thank you, Claudia, Sang, and Nina, for the great presentations and your contribution. Thank you again to the team that is supporting ASCOR, and to the audience for staying with us until now. Please do continue to follow the work that we're doing on ASCOR. For those of you who are in London, we are hosting an event at the London School of Economics on the 26th of February as part of the LSE public lecture programs, discussing how to invest in a national climate action. We will discuss how to make the NDCs investable, and we'll also continue to talk about ASCOR. You can attend in person, but there will also be an opportunity to follow the event online. We will post the link to the event in the chat very shortly. Thank you so much for bearing with us. Do continue to follow the series of webinars that the TPI Center organizes. We're been able to keep up to a regular frequency so far, and we aim to continue to do so. Until the next time, goodbye.